Hey everyone, I am professional photographer Ian Plant, and my goal, my one mission in life, is to help you become the best photographer that you can be. And I am honored and privileged to work with some of the best photographers on the planet. And today we are joined by an immensely talented photographer. I am always so amazed and very jealous when I see what he has come up with. Greg Basco, welcome to Photo Talk.
Ian, thanks. What an introduction. Let me just say I'm a big admirer of your work as well, and so it's an honor to be here, and it's good to catch up. We haven't seen each other in years.
Why don't we start off learning a little bit more about you? Tell us where you're based now and how you got into photography.
Sure. And well, let me just say again, thanks so much for the kind words. That means a lot coming from you. And I'm in my home office in Costa Rica right now, where I've lived for about the past 25 years. I'm from the U.S. originally. I came to Costa Rica after I graduated undergrad in the U.S., and I enrolled in the Peace Corps, in the U.S. Peace Corps. I was sent to Costa Rica in the town where I live now, which is actually my wife's hometown. And so while I was in the Peace Corps, I fell in love with the rainforest, and I fell in love with one very special lady, a Costa Rican lady named Ana, who became my wife. We're still married today. And I went back with Ana to the U.S. for a few years after the Peace Corps. And then we got married. I went to grad school and I studied conservation. Came back to Costa Rica and started working on my thesis research. And in the course of that, started getting really into photography. I finished school, I worked for a couple of years, and then I just decided that photography was really calling me much more than writing grant proposals and things like that. And so I made a dive and went full in on photography, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
That is really interesting that you started photography in Costa Rica, and it makes me wonder how much the landscape had an impact on your approach to photography. I know from personal experience that working in the rainforest can be very challenging, and I know that there's not a lot of light breaking through, and I'm wondering how that might have impacted your artistic style.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it really is a different habitat than a lot of places that people photograph, that I actually haven't had that much opportunity to photograph in places that are more wide open and lots of space. And, basically starting photography when I was in Costa Rica, that's kind of shaped how I do photography. I use a lot of flash. I know we'll probably talk a little bit about that later. But just because of the fact that you don't have a lot of light in the rainforest, it is hard to find the subjects. You think of a rainforest as being teeming with life, and it certainly is. But it's not like some of those posters you see where you see every animal in the forest right in one frame. It can be really hard, as you know, having been to Costa Rica. You could walk, go on a night walk, and you might not see much of anything, maybe a couple spiders, maybe a cricket. And so it can be tough for sure. One of the things I've found, since I do have a background kind of in ecology and conservation, is that it's really helpful to be a good naturalist, as it is in any kind of nature photography. But maybe in the rainforest, that's almost even more helpful than in other areas, just in the sense that there are so many different kinds of animals, and they're fairly scarce and hard to see.
One of my favorite photos of yours is a shot that shows some black vultures drying their wings in the sunlight. And this looks like it was taken in very harsh light in the middle of the day. And I love how you expose only for the highlights, letting everything else go into shadow. And it's a really wonderful abstract photo. And it seems to me that you were working in very harsh light. And I know from personal experience that the light in that part of the world can be very challenging to work with. Is it fair to say that you've learned to embrace artistically the kinds of light that other photographers would walk away from?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question and a good point. Certainly, and I like that photo too. So thanks. It's tough, because you don't really have good light in the rainforest. And I probably shouldn't say that as someone who does photo tours. Come down to Costa Rica and work in awful light, right? But it's true. A lot of people say, well, are we going to get the sweet light? Well, when you're close to the equator, there's only maybe 30 minutes at the very end or beginning of the day that has sweet light. And most of the time you're under a forest canopy, so it doesn't matter anyway. So you're faced with shooting, like you said, harsh light, contrasty light, whether you're out in more open areas, as I was for the photo you mentioned, by the way, and I'll get back to that, or you're under the forest canopy and dealing with a lot of dappled light. Or you have a cloudy day where you have nice soft light, but there's not a lot of that light, and so you're always struggling with slow shutter speeds, with higher ISOs, and so I'm definitely, I just don't get presented with those perfect kind of bird portrait opportunities, talking about birds specifically, that people get in a lot of places. And so what I've learned, and maybe that's just the kind of thing I like to do as well, is not maybe or not hopefully get the same shot that everybody else gets, but look for something that's a little different. And so, when you have harsh light like that, you can certainly expose for the highlights, just like I did with that black vulture photo. And that one was out in the open, by the way, on the Tarcoles River on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. And so that was on a riverbank, but it was probably, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which in the tropics is still very, very harsh light. So by exposing for only the bright part of those vulture wings as they were drying their wings in the sun, I think it had rained, and then they came out to dry their wings after the rain. I was able to keep the wings in pretty deep shadow, the darker feathers. And that's one of the things, sometimes we want more dynamic range, but I often embrace the fact that our cameras don't have the same dynamic range as our eyes and work with deep shadow. On that photo in question, I did a little creative darkening to up that effect even more. So there was even less detail in the dark feathers of the wings, and the bright parts of the wings stood out even more. But that's certainly something that caught my eye right away, rather than saying, oh, this light is awful, I won't even shoot. I thought, wow, this is great. I can do something interesting.
There's another photo of yours that really caught my eye that uses a similar technique. It's a photo of a guanaco from the Patagonia region of southern Chile. And in this shot, once again, you exposed only for the highlights, and all you can see is the rim light around the guanaco and the sun behind the guanaco. Everything else goes completely black, completely into shadow. Once again, this is a photo that uses really harsh light that most photographers would never even think of using, but you embraced the light and created something that was beautifully artistic.
Yeah, thanks. That's one of my favorites, actually, and that was one where I think having kind of learned photography in the rainforest, that set me up for looking for what was definitely suboptimal light, normally suboptimal light, in a place that has an abundance of light, right? Southern Chile. I know you've been down there too, and there are wide open spaces and a lot of beautiful, majestic light where you can include everything in a scene. But maybe having dealt with that so much, maybe my eye is just kind of trained to seek out those deep shadows and opportunities for rim light like that. But one of the reasons I like doing that and really letting shadows go dark, as you mentioned, is because in the rainforest you usually have very busy backgrounds. So trying to isolate your subject for wildlife or bird portraits can be tough. So if you can look for areas where you have nice light on your subject, whether it's backlight or side light or front light, but backgrounds in the shade, you can really deal with that contrast and minimize the effect of your background and really make your subject stand out. So on that day when I took the guanaco down in Chile, I actually walked away from that at first. I was in a car with my friend, and we drove, and then we got in the car, we drove away. We stopped there first, and I was like, this isn't very interesting, not much going on. I think we drove a couple hundred meters, and I said, wait, stop, I want to go back. And that's where I kind of had the idea to do that shot. And, the way I exposed it was kind of an educated guess that turned out to be right on. I'm shooting right into the sun, which is probably not a great idea. So right away, I maxed out all my values, right? I went right to 1/8,000th of a second. I stopped down to f/22. I didn't have a neutral density filter on, and that would have made it tough for another reason too. And I went to my lowest ISO, which I think was 50. I was shooting a body that went to ISO 50. And just hoped that would properly expose for the rim light on the guanaco, and the sun's going to be blown out, right? It's the sun. I wasn't worried about that. And I took a test shot, and to my amazement, it was right on. And it's a good thing it wasn't overexposed because, like I said, I didn't really have anywhere else to go from there. So what I did from there is I placed a focus point as high as I could in the viewfinder of my camera, and I looked at the guanaco and focused on the guanaco without including the sun in the frame. He's really far away, so I thought close enough was going to be fine. And then I would close my eyes and just swing the camera up and shoot off a little burst and hope I had framed it right. And after a few tries, I got some keepers. But that was a good way to do it, I think.
A lot of your photos seem to be meticulously planned, and I get the feeling that pre-planning is an important part of your process. But other photos, like the photo of the vultures drying their wings in the sun, seems to me to be the kind of thing that maybe you just stumbled upon when you were out there and you said, oh, I could make a cool shot, even though the light's kind of bad. But you have a lot of these harsh light photos, so I'm wondering if these are just shots that you stumble upon, or are you actually pre-planning bad light shots knowing that that is what you might encounter?
Well, I don't know if I'd read too much into that, but yeah, I don't know. It's certainly you're right, and I think I know you work the same way in terms. I mean, sometimes you just come upon something and it's right there, right? And you go with what you're given. But I think from my interpretation of the kind of stuff you do too, you oftentimes have a vision of what you want the final product to be. Now, that might be different as things change once you're on site, right? But you're always looking for something that you have in mind. And sometimes that's not really a pre-planned process. It might be just a fleeting moment, like that guanaco picture that we were talking about. But still, quickly, I came up with a plan, given the lighting conditions, and tried to put something into place that would work out. I'm a big believer in the fact that if you come across a good subject, there's usually a good photo to be made somewhere in there. And it might not be the traditional photo, and maybe that's a good thing, but there's usually something you can do. And it might not be the photo you had planned, but if you work with bad light, I think often you can get keepers that can stand out from the crowd.
You've got some really incredible photos of glass frogs, and they seem to be very well camouflaged. And the trips I took to Costa Rica, I didn't see anything like that. And I'm really fascinated by these. They seem to be very translucent. It's almost like they're invisible.
They really are. No, you can actually see, and you can in some of them. I don't remember how many glass frog species there are, and I think they're only in the neotropics. I don't think they're in the old world tropics. But there are a lot of different species. I don't know, maybe 100 throughout the neotropics, perhaps. And some of them are even more transparent than others. But they all have that translucent quality. And I read just the other day that they think it is kind of a form of camouflage where it can just blend right into a leaf. And they're really hard to find. And so I'm not surprised you didn't see one, because you obviously haven't spent as much time in tropical rainforests as I have living here. But you don't see them every day. And you tend to see them on rainy nights. And they'll come out more at night. During the day, they're usually just on top of a leaf sleeping, and you just see a little green blob. So they'll come out on rainy nights, and the best place to find them is along kind of fast-moving streams, because that's where they look to breed. And they'll lay their eggs on leaves that overhang the water. And when the eggs hatch, the tadpoles drop right into some quickly moving water, so they can avoid predators. So half the battle is kind of knowing what kind of conditions are good to possibly find one, and where would be a good condition to find one.
It is possible. When I was there, I saw thousands of them. I just didn't know that I was seeing them.
Well, I'm sure you walked past a few during the day or at night. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. You probably passed a few venomous vipers too that you didn't see.
I did see a fer-de-lance when I was there. It was hanging out in the garden at the lodge I was staying at, and I saw it every day for several days in a row, but I never mustered up the courage to get in close to get a really effective photograph of it. And You seem to be doing a lot of photos of snakes where you're getting very close, often with wide-angle lenses. So I guess my question is, are they as dangerous as they look, or are these shots more controlled than they might appear?
No, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, some of those will be shot, different ones in kind of controlled conditions, where maybe friends who are much better snake handlers than I am, because I'm not good at it at all. I don't really have a phobia of snakes, but I definitely have a healthy respect for them. And so I've had some help in kind of wrangling in some of those shots. And that can be typical. And those are the kind of shots where, if I've really moved an animal, I wouldn't send that to like a contest or something like that. But it's almost impossible to just come across animals on a frequent basis in the rainforest. It's hard enough to find them one time, but to come across them and they're in a perfect spot for a photo, doesn't happen often, right? But it can happen. But sometimes they need a little help. And, one of the things, the more dangerous snakes are actually, except for the fertile ants, that's an exception because those are known to be really aggressive and they're big, right? But a lot of other venomous vipers, like eyelash palm pit vipers, for instance, those are sit-and-wait predators. And so unless you really, really bother them, they're not going to strike at you. And so you can get quite close to them. So I don't have any problem working with the wide-angle lens and even setting up my tripod, a few inches from certain snakes like that. I will try not to, stick my hand out and focus on the focusing ring. I'll try to use a cable release. I'll try to, keep my work kind of behind the camera, of course, just in case. But actually, in general, the venomous ones are less aggressive than the non-venomous ones because the non-venomous ones will do lots of kind of defensive threat displays and things like that to show that they don't want you to mess with them. The other guys, I think, just know you don't want to mess with them, and they know that you know that.
You've got so many inspiring photos, but one of your very best is this great shot of a tree frog on a flower against a starry night sky. I'd love to learn more about how that shot came about.
Yeah, that's a shot that I'm proud of because it took some visualization, like we were talking about before, certainly. And it's a shot I'd had in mind for years and years, and I took it now, I guess, about 5 years ago. And but what I couldn't figure out, the red-eyed tree frogs are pretty easy to find if you know where to look in Costa Rica. They're a pretty common frog. They're not endangered at all. So they're not hard to find in that sense, and there are some places where they're quite easy to find, especially again on a rainy night. They're nocturnal frogs. And so, one of the things I wanted to do is that it's probably the most photographed frog in the world, right? It's on all sorts of coffee mugs and hats and things like that. And so I wanted to do something that was different, but that was certainly authentic in terms of the frog's behavior and its habitat. And so again, it's a nocturnal tree frog, right? And it will come down to still ponds in the forest on a rainy night to mate, and they'll lay their eggs. But they can be all the way up at the top of the canopy, moving around looking for food. Bugs mostly is what they eat. And so I wanted a shot that showed the habitat of the red-eyed tree frog, and at night. I see a lot of people take photos of them during the day, and they'll say, well, it looks more natural with natural light. And they can look really nice, but it's a nocturnal frog. During the day, kind of like the glass frogs, that guy would be a little green blob sleeping usually under a leaf or along a stem somewhere. And so I wanted something that really showed the frog in its nocturnal habitat. And I had this idea of using a wide-angle lens and making it basically, a starry sky night landscape shot with light painting on the foreground. I mean, that's the basic concept, right? Where you're exposing for the starry sky, and then you're using another light source to work on your subject. In this case, I used flash. And so the tricky part about this was, we found a frog. I was with my friend Paolo, who's my business partner with my photo tour company in Costa Rica. Paolo's an ecologist. And so we went to this place where there are a lot of these frogs. We found one. We moved him around onto a flower that we liked. It's called poro, the red flower that he's on, real typical rainforest tree. And I set up a 20 millimeter lens on a tripod just inches from the frog. And so the idea is that, again, my exposure was a long exposure, like 20 seconds or something like that, your typical kind of starry sky, stars as points, night exposure. And then I used flash to light up the frog. Now, I could have used a flashlight, a continuous light source, but I wanted to use flash because I had a real depth of field problem. And, hyperfocal distance just wouldn't work because I was about maybe 6 inches from the frog. And so there's no way shooting at f2.8, which is what I needed to get, to keep my shutter speed to 20 seconds at ISO 3200 or whatever it is, something like that. There's no way I was going to have enough depth of field. There was no way I would have had enough depth of field even at f16 to pull off that shot where the frog is so close. So this was kind of one of those in the shower moments. It was a lot of long showers, but it finally came to me, and I wanted to get it in one shot. I didn't want to stack one where I focused on the stars and one where I focused on the frog. I was trying to figure out how to do it in one shot, and it came to me that I have 20 seconds. I have just a really small fraction of a second that the flash is going to do the work on the frog. So then I have 19.8 seconds or whatever to change my focus from 6 inches out to just shy of infinity for the star. I did a practice, and I figured out where my shy of infinity was for that particular lens. I think it was a Sigma 20 millimeter lens, and I wadded up a little piece of duct tape so that I could find that with my fingers quickly to change the focus. And so essentially what you have is you have the frog lit for 1/5000th of a second or whatever the duration of my flash was, and I had the flash off camera with the small softbox. And then after the flash went off, the frog is essentially done. He could have moved if he wanted to, and it wouldn't have affected the photo at all. And so I quickly changed my focus ring out to the little wadded up piece of duct tape, and the stars were properly exposed and properly focused for 19.5 seconds out of the 20-second exposure.
This is an amazing photo. I imagine it must have taken a lot of time to plan and then execute it while you were in the field.
Yeah, well, it was probably about a half hour or so. I mean, we were at a lodge where there are lots of these guys, so we went out of our room and did it. Yeah, and it turned out well.
Wait, this only took a half an hour? Oh, that answer makes me feel like less of a man. I love that you use flash a lot in your work. I like to use it myself, especially when I'm photographing wildlife, but I've noticed that a lot of photographers seem to shy away from using flash, and I think it's because they don't like that artificial flashed look. So tell us more about how you use flash creatively in your photography and how you avoid that obviously flashed look.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right on that a lot of nature photographers, I think particularly, tend to shy away from flash, and a lot of people will say, well, I don't like the way that flash looks. It looks artificial, just like you said. But that's really because they're not using it right, or they haven't learned to use it right. Another thing, again, working in the rainforest, you have to use flash a lot. It's just a necessary fact of life. So I learned early on in my first years. I shot 1 year of film before I moved to digital, and so I remember keeping notes of this flash power on slide number 1, this one on slide number 2, and going about that. But I'm sure glad I learned it, and because it really does open up all sorts of creative worlds for you, and basically you can shoot any time of day. It doesn't matter. You're not pinned to waiting for great natural light. I love great natural light as much as the next photographer, but it's not often you get it. And especially in the tropics, especially in the rainforest. But I've used flash in Chile that's super wide open. I've used it in New Mexico and the U.S. And so and I've seen some really nice flash work that you've done in different places that are also wide open places. And so whether you're shooting with a macro lens, a telephoto lens, or a wide angle lens, flash just opens up so many creative avenues for you, and also solving just regular kind of dynamic range problems, right? Where maybe you couldn't do exposure blending because your subject's moving. So flash can allow you to deal with those range of contrasts while keeping sharp pictures. And so I use flash a lot. In fact, I'd never go anywhere without at least 2 flashes when I'm out photographing and a transmitter. But so to me, it's all about when you're using flash as fill, where you're trying to balance the flash with natural light. It's all about leaving some of the shadows that are created by that natural light. So you're using flash in small doses so that you don't overpower the natural shadows, because that's exactly what makes a picture look flashed when there are no longer any shadows and all the light is coming from straight on, from direct on axis, because then you can't create any shadows and it looks flashed. And then the other way is when you're using flash as main light on your subject, let's say back to the frog picture we were just discussing at night, then you have to make sure you get your flash off camera and create some shadows that look natural. And so I'm often using my flash off camera in those situations with either I brought along a couple props, because I know some people aren't that familiar with flash, but a simple TTL off camera cord like this can be a great way to get your flash off camera. And then another way is a little flash transmitter, or especially a radio flash transmitter. And then from there, I'm usually using, I'm just going to show a few little soft boxes that I would use to soften the light, diffuse the light, and importantly to make it a larger light source. And that's what really leads to pleasing flash, is making the light source as large as possible relative to your subject. And that's the same difference as on a a sunny day at midday versus a cloudy sky. In a cloudy sky, you have a nice massive diffuser, kind of like this guy would be for macro work. And so those are my main rules. It's all about leaving natural shadows when you can, or if natural light isn't really doing anything to your subject, it's all about creating natural looking shadows.
Another thing that you seem to do a lot of is to mix flash with long exposures. And that way you get motion blur in the final image, but the flash will freeze the subject during the long exposure. So I'm curious to learn more about this technique and what led you to this approach.
I can't remember when I started thinking about that. I'm sure I saw other photos of people. I mean, I certainly didn't invent the technique of mixing flash with longer shutter speeds. But at some point, I just became really interested in different ways to portray motion. Like all of us, I like silky water in rivers or waterfalls. And then I thought, well, why couldn't that same effect be applied to a hummingbird, let's say, whose wings are beating really, really fast, and so you could get some blur. But if you added in a little bit of flash at the same time, you could get a nice mix of a sharp body and head along with motion blur in the wings. And then you can extend that to all sorts of things that move, right? Or you could have a stationary subject that you light with flash, and then you could let the rest of the scene move, especially with a wide-angle lens. In fact, that red-eyed tree frog shot we were talking about a bit ago with the stars, I did another one shortly after that. I did a 45-minute exposure and did basically the same thing. I used flash to illuminate the frog and the plant he was on, and then I changed my focus quickly, and then I let it go for 45 minutes, so I got star trails. So it's just, I don't know, to me it's a really interesting technique in terms of in terms of your technical skills as a photographer. I think that's really important, to be a good technical photographer, but that's not the end goal. Obviously, it's being able to think of how you could use these techniques to get a really cool artistic effect in the end.
Greg, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And frankly, I could talk with you all day. But unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to have you come back for a future episode of Photo Talk.
Likewise, Ian, it would be a pleasure to come back anytime and talk with you more.
All right, great. We'll talk to you then. Bye.
Bye, Ian. Take care.